Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So, oh God, today's case. Oh God, we just all need to take a deep breath because today's case is one of the most disturbing cases I have come across in recent times. Because today we are covering the case where an OB-GYN doctor was sexually abusing his female patients for over 20 years, which included grooming, fondling, twisting, inappropriate touching, and penetration. And this evil man goes by the name of Dr. Robert Haddon.
6 victims, 9 counts, criminal sexual abuse, women who were forcibly touched, orally violated. The alleged perpetrator, a respected OB-GYN at Columbia University Medical Center.
And then in 2012, which is 2 decades after Robert started his campaign of abuse against his patients, a patient of his called Lori Kanyuk went to him for just a routine appointment. She was currently pregnant. And in the middle of the examination, when Lori was lying down on the table, this evil doctor started licking her down there. Yes, you heard that right. Dr. Robert Haddon, an OB-GYN doctor, started licking one of his patients during an examination. And if that doesn't turn your stomach, make your skin crawl, I don't know what will. And Lori was horrified beyond belief. She was so traumatized. She went to authorities, tried to get this man arrested. But what Lori didn't realize is that she had just opened up a huge can of worms and exposed some of the most despicable and horrific sexual abuse ever carried out by a doctor. And in total, his victim count runs into the hundreds, if not more. But there was also a huge cover-up by a major university. And that is what we are getting into today. This case is going to be a lot. We have a lot to get through. There are so many victims, and I feel like it was important to share this case. These victims, their story needs to be heard, and I truly couldn't believe that this case doesn't have more coverage. But please just be aware this case is going to be very, very uncomfortable to listen to. So just please be aware of that before continuing on with this video, and let's jump in. And I just want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, and that is June's Journey. And if you guys haven't started playing June's Journey yet, what are you waiting for? Go and start right now, because it is the perfect game to relax with on these cold winter nights. I find that June's Journey just distracts my brain after a long day of research, which, as you know, with these videos, it can take me into very, very heavy topics. And I have been playing this game for the longest time now, and if you play this game, you know it is the perfect game for all of us obsessed with true crime and mystery and thriller. Because you play as Detective June Parker, whose sister has been murdered, you then need to find the hidden objects in these gorgeously designed scenes which lead to clues to helping solve the murder. But not just that, you get to decorate your very own June's Journey island. And you all know that I love this part of the game. And I have recently been taking part in the Year of the Dragon Travels event, trying to collect as many decorations as possible. I love my tranquil tiger, and I'm hoping to get the Chinese dragon, because I love dragons. And I know from comments from when I've done June's Journey sponsorships in the past, I know so many of you already play June's Journey and are obsessed with June's Journey as much as I am. And if you don't already play June's Journey, I highly recommend it. And June's Journey is available on iOS and Android as well as on PC. And you can download June's Journey for free by going to the link in my description box. And using that link really does help out this channel because it lets June's Journey know that you came from this video. So what are you waiting for? Click on that link, download June's Journey and start playing right away, and I can tell you now, you will be hooked. So thank you again to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video, but thank you to every single one of you watching right now, because truly without all of you guys, I wouldn't get opportunities like this. And now let's jump into today's case. Robert Haddon was born in 1959. An exact date of birth is not known, and he grew up in Long Island, New York, where he lived with his parents and his 3 siblings. And Robert did not have a good upbringing at all. It's said that he had a lonely, confusing, and overly sexualized childhood that left him desperate for attention and approval. He was also born legally blind in one eye, was also hard of hearing in one ear, and this led to a lot of bullying and isolation. On top of this, his mom was also an alcoholic, and she was just very distant. She wasn't emotionally available. Quite often, Robert would come home from school, for example, and he would find his mom just passed out on the sofa because she had drank so much alcohol. His dad was also barely at home, but when his dad was at home, his dad was cold, unemotional, never gave Robert any support whatsoever. So you can understand why Robert grew up craving attention and affection, because he's basically not getting any from home. But if you think that is bad, it gets worse, because Robert was also sexually abused by his older brother. It is said that there was a, quote, sexual dynamic between all 4 siblings. And this mostly came from Robert's older brother, William. He was the main aggressor. And it is said that whenever the parents were out of the home, William would make Robert perform sex acts on him. And Robert was between the ages of 11 and 13 when this sexual abuse started. And of course, he was extremely traumatized by this. It is said that he developed very blurred sexual boundaries. He didn't understand what healthy sex meant. And he really didn't have anyone to turn to talk to about this abuse or even report the abuse, because his parents were either not at home or not emotionally there for him to support him through this and possibly stop it. And then when Robert grew into his older teenage years, he really just started to withdraw even more. He started to just shrink into the background at school. It was like he barely even existed. His classmates don't even really remember him. He also became somewhat of a primary caregiver in the home. He basically looked after his mom whenever she was hungover. He would pick her up from the floor, clean up after her, empty all of the alcohol bottles out. He also kind of stood in between his mom and dad when they were arguing. He would try and prevent this from happening. And Robert soon became his mom's favorite child, which Robert was desperate for. He was desperate for any kind of affection. And she just kept telling Robert over and over again how smart he was and how she wanted him to grow up and be a doctor. And Robert took this very much to heart. And at this point, Robert's whole family just became really dysfunctional. His older sister, Elizabeth, also became an alcoholic herself. She also had an abusive boyfriend, which Robert had to protect her from. His 18-year-old brother, William, i.e. the sexual abuser, he turned into a heroin addict. He would often steal money from the family to buy his drugs, and he also got into a lot of trouble with gangs. And when Robert was 15 years old, his mom disappeared from the home for several weeks. No one knew where she was. So Robert, at only 15, he's probably taking care of the house. And then, when his mom eventually did return, it was discovered that she had tried to take her own life. That is why she had disappeared. She came home with bandages on her wrists. And Robert was incredibly traumatized by this as well. He was incredibly confused. He kept thinking to himself, why does my mom want to leave me? All Robert ever wanted to do was make his mom proud, make his mom love him. And he probably took this to heart, thinking that it was probably his fault. And then when Robert finished high school, he had big dreams of becoming a doctor. He really wanted to fulfill the wishes that his mom had for him. So that's what he went on to do. He went on to get his medical degree in Florida. And again, he just kind of sunk into the background. However, there was something very significant that happened at this time in Robert's life. And that is that he met his future wife, a woman called Carol. And Robert and Carol became inseparable. They fell in love so quickly. There was barely a moment when they were apart. And then a few years later, they are married and they go on to have 2 children, a daughter named Emily and then a son named Alex. Now, Alex was born with a disability and he was unable to look after himself. He needed 24/7 care. He was unable to do basic things for himself, like he had to be bathed. He really struggled with walking. He needed to be fed. And Alex's disability was a disability that was going to affect him for the rest of his life. He would never be able to live independently. And this had a huge strain on Robert and Carol, in particular Robert though, because he had to become his son's primary caregiver because his wife Carol already had a chronic health condition herself. So Robert has taken on a lot of responsibility, taking complete care of his son, possibly also taking care of his wife, and also trying to get his medical degree and all the placements that he'll have to do in hospitals and stuff. And it's probably very reminiscent to his childhood, where he basically became the primary caregiver for his mom. And Robert, even though he stayed strong for his family, it is also said that around this time he suffered from depression and anxiety. But he bottled it all up and he never talked to anybody about his struggles and he left them untreated. And then by the time we get to Robert in his 30s, he has now completed his medical training. He is a doctor. And then after this, Robert gets his first proper job at Columbia University Hospital. And this was also known as the Columbia University Irving Medical Center, located in Upper Manhattan, which treated thousands of patients across the city. I also read that it is part of the New York Presbyterian Hospital, for those of you that are familiar with that area. And he's got a job at Columbia University. I think we need to let that sink in. Columbia is obviously a very prestigious university. It has a reputation for being one of the best universities in the US, if not in the world. It is one of the universities that actually does have a name and a reputation outside of the US. But I want to stress this right now. Columbia University Hospital are not innocent at all. So please bear that in mind throughout the rest of today's case. And what kind of doctor is Robert at the Columbia University Hospital? Well, he was going to be working in the OB-GYN department as a gynecologist. And this is unfortunately where today's case becomes very, very disturbing straight away. You will need to prepare yourselves from this moment going forward. There were so many times when I was doing my research for today's case that I actually had to just step away and just do something else because it is that disturbing. So Robert, he's now obviously at his job. It is currently the early 90s, and for the first few years of his job, everyone loved Robert. People couldn't say a bad word about Robert. He was so popular with his patients. There were some patients that even traveled out of state to visit Robert because he was that good. He was good at his job. He was so friendly. He made the patients feel valued, listened to, important. He was also popular with other staff members. People said that he was quiet, maybe a little bit awkward, but he was just always kind and friendly, always happy to help. Never kicked up a fuss, never complained about anything, was just a really great guy to work with. But what his colleagues didn't realize at the time, that behind the smiles that he would give people passing in the hallways, behind his charismatic personality, there was something way more sinister going on. And this is now where some of Robert's disgusting practices would actually be witnessed by somebody else for the very first time. And they were witnessed by a fellow staff member working in the hospital. Because one day Robert was going about his usual routine. He was carrying out a routine examination on a patient. He also had a nursing assistant in the room with him, a woman called Terry. And Terry had assisted hundreds, if not thousands, of gynecological examinations. She was experienced. She knew what she was doing. She knew what a doctor should be doing. So the appointment went about as normal. The examination was normal. Terry was there in the room, making notes and stuff. Robert was doing everything by the book. The examination finished, the patient climbed off the table, and it was over. After the examination, Terry, the assistant, she left the room, which was standard procedure, to give Dr. Robert Haddon and the patient some privacy to discuss some of the test results, blah, blah, blah. However, on this occasion, when Terry was walking down the corridor, she realized that she had forgotten her stethoscope. So she went back to Robert's room to retrieve it. She got to the door, she knocked on the door because obviously doctor-patient confidentiality, she didn't want to disturb anything, but there was no reply from the room. So Terry opened up the door to see if anyone was in there. Can she go in and get her stethoscope? And what she saw horrified her to her core, because she saw the patient was back on the examination table, which was not normal. The examination was over. The patient should not be back on that table. So the patient was back on the medical table and the patient had a sheet over their legs. But that wasn't the disturbing thing that she saw. Oh no, because she saw Robert at the end of the examination table. With his left hand, he was holding the woman's leg open. And with his right hand, he was moving it up and down behind the sheet that Terry knew was not in a medical way. Robert's eyes were shut, his face was red and flustered, and his head was facing towards the ceiling. And what was Robert doing? Well, all that Terry could work out was, quote, playing with the patient's vagina in order to get his sexual kicks. Yeah, you heard that right. Terry, the nursing assistant, has walked in on Dr. Robert Haddon, touching a patient in a sexual way. Because it turns out, as soon as Terry had left the room after the examination, Robert was now alone with his patient. And he told this poor, innocent patient that he needed to perform just one more check. So could she get back onto the examination table? And this patient, obviously trusting her doctor, did exactly that. So now Robert was alone with his patient. He covered her legs with a sheet so she couldn't see what he was doing. And this is when he started to fondle the patient's vagina to get his own sexual gratification, which is why his face was red and flustered, why his eyes were shut. He was basically pleasuring himself doing this. There was no medical purpose for what Robert was doing. There was no innocent explanation for what he was doing. And Terry, the assistant, walked in and saw the whole thing. Now, this should be the only incident that happened. Terry should have left that room, reported Robert for what he was doing. Robert should have been arrested. End of case. But that's not what happened. No, that is not what happened. Because Terry left that room, she was frozen. She was traumatized by what she saw, but she never uttered a word about what she saw to anyone. So this was in the early 1990s, and she believed that because she was just a nursing assistant, it was her word against a doctor's, and she wouldn't be believed. So there was no point in her going to a colleague or going to the police because she wouldn't be believed. So what would be the point? And that may be the case, but that's not really an excuse for not reporting what she saw. She was a nursing assistant and she had a responsibility to care about her patients. And obviously it is Dr. Robert Haddon's fault. He's completely disgusting and he has now gotten away with sexually abusing one of his patients. However, was this his first sexual assault? We just don't know. If you want my opinion, I am going to say no. This was not his first sexual assault. This was just the first time he got caught. Because the fact that Terry, the assistant, left the room and Robert was so emboldened to just get straight into abusing a patient, no hesitation, no waiting around or anything, he just got straight to it. That tells me that he has done this before, that he's probably done it many times before and gotten away with it, and it's just routine for him. But obviously there's no proof of that, so that's just my opinion. However, what we do know is that going forward from this moment on, Robert would carry out these sexual assaults of his female patients over and over and over again. Because as the 90s wore on, Robert would now sexually assault many more patients on separate occasions. And you're probably thinking one of the main thoughts that you have in your head is how the hell is he getting away with it and how did the patients not know what was going on? Well, it turns out in his early campaign of how he would carry out this abuse, Robert had a little playbook that he would follow and he perfected this routine. He knew exactly what to do, what to say to get away with sexually assaulting his patients. Because in the early days, the main victims that he would target were younger women that had never been to an OB-GYN before. So they didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what it would feel like. And Robert used this to his advantage. He also used women going through their first pregnancy, so they didn't know what kind of checkups were going on, what Robert was doing down there. Robert was very particular with the victims that he chose. And after identifying patients that he saw as vulnerable, he would do everything in his power to develop a close relationship with these patients. He attempted to develop a rapport with them. Like I said, Robert was loved by a lot of people, by staff and patients, because he was friendly. And that's exactly what he did with his patients. He tried to make them feel comfortable. He would ask questions about their personal lives and listen to them. He would also talk about his own personal life, talking about his wife or his children. He just seemed relatable. He didn't seem like an intimidating doctor. He also gave patients his personal phone number, and he would tell the patient that anytime, day or night, if they needed anything, they could call him. And he did truly mean that, because he was basically grooming his victims right now. Especially when you realize some of the ages of these victims. A lot of his victims were minors. Young girls that had never been to an OB-GYN before. Some of them were going through a pregnancy. Some of them were very vulnerable as well as emotionally vulnerable. And Robert would spend a lot of hours outside of business hours talking to his patients. And this is just disgusting. He was probably getting his sexual kicks from this as well. He was probably sat there on the phone talking to these women late at night, thinking about how he was going to assault them on their next appointment. And then once Robert had built up a relationship with his patients, on their third or fourth appointment, this is when Robert would assault them. And once again, the assaults in the earlier days are very similar to the victim that we've already spoken about. The initial examination would all go fine, everything would be by the book. Robert would then be alone with his patient and he would say, "Oh, I just need to check one more thing," or this doesn't look quite right, maybe we need to have another look. And he would get his victim back on the examination table and then he would assault them. And if any of the victims ever questioned Robert, if they ever said, what the hell are you doing? Robert would just gaslight them and say, oh, this is totally normal. I'm just performing this examination, or I'm just checking for this. I just need to rub my fingers in this area to just check something. He would belittle his patients. He would use medical terminology. He would use his position of power and authority to completely manipulate his patients into thinking that what he was doing was normal. And some of his patients did think, is there something inappropriate going on here? And if they ever did that, their usual response was just to leave Robert as a doctor and go somewhere else. So once again, Robert is getting away with sexually assaulting his patients and no one is reporting him. And unbelievably, this goes on for years. Throughout all of the 90s, Robert is sexually assaulting his patients on a regular basis. And now we are going to cover some of the individual accounts of some of Robert's victims. And the first we are going to talk about is just a 16-year-old girl. She was only 16. She is under the age of consent in New York. She was a minor. She was from the Bronx and she was currently 5 weeks pregnant. Now, she had never seen a gynecologist before, so she was the perfect victim for Robert. And all she remembers is that Robert carried out an unnecessarily long examination, that he was incredibly rough with her, and he didn't even stop when she said he was hurting her. And the young girl, she actually did file a complaint, but she was just transferred from one department to the next, saying, oh no, sorry, you've got to complain to this department. Here's the number. And then she would phone that number, and then that number would say, oh no, you need to phone this number. She was just being passed around and she was just being ignored. No one at Columbia University, the hospital, no one wanted to listen to her. But if you think that's worse, wait till you hear about what Robert does to the next victim. And I do need to warn you, this is not easy to listen to, because this girl is another minor. We don't know her exact age, but we know that targeting minors is definitely Robert's MO, which is just absolutely disgusting. And during the examination, the nurse left the room, so Robert was on his own with this minor, and he instructed her to climb onto the examination table and bend over in front of him on her hands and knees. And there was no medical reason why she should be doing this. Robert was just doing this to get his sexual kicks. And then he started groping this underage girl's breasts, which included pinching her nipples. And Robert said that this was just a routine breast examination. But then he also penetrated this girl from behind with his fingers. And already, I'm just lost for words when it comes to this case, but we have barely even scratched the surface. But there is one more victim who was a minor that we need to talk about that Robert treated even worse. And this girl, she was a student. She was only 15 years old. And Robert would soon embark on a journey of grooming this girl. He used his position of power to gain her trust. And during her appointments, Robert would ask her wildly inappropriate questions. He would ask her about her sexual history, about her sexual activity, if she was still a virgin. He would ask how close she had gotten to having sexual intercourse with someone. And all of these questions were asked in an inappropriate way, and this 15-year-old girl didn't initiate any of this conversation, and he was just being really sexual in the way he was asking these questions. He would just look at her in a very sexually inappropriate way, just checking her out, her 15-year-old body. He would compliment her on her appearance, on her body. And all of this was when a nursing assistant was in the room. And then when the nurse did leave the room, Robert took things to a whole nother level. Because this is when he told the 15-year-old girl that he had one more exam to carry out. So Robert removed his gloves and ordered the 15-year-old girl to remove all of her clothes and strip in front of him before he, quote, rubbed his hands up and down her body, groped her breasts, spread her buttocks, examined the crevices of the most intimate parts of her body, spread her vagina as he leered into her private areas before inserting his fingers into her vagina. And I'm really sorry about the graphic language that I'm using. I am literally taking this directly from the court documents. And I know these things are uncomfortable to hear about, uncomfortable to talk about, but these kinds of cases are important to talk about. And if we don't use this kind of language, if we don't talk about them in this kind of manner, if we don't talk about these things out in the open, people, or should I say monsters, like Dr. Robert Haddon, may continue to go unnoticed in the future. So after this exam of the 15-year-old girl, Robert managed to convince this girl that what he had done to her was normal. It was a normal experience of seeing a gynecologist. However, as we know, that could not be further from the truth. He was just doing it to satisfy his pedophilic desires. And honestly, my blood is boiling. Like, I truly get so angry with people like this, abusing their position of power and taking advantage of people in general, but especially minors, especially vulnerable people that don't know what is happening to them is wrong. But of course, it only gets worse from here, because we now move on to his next victim, who is a woman called Diane Monson. And in 1993, Diane was living in New York. She was currently 37 years old. And currently, Diane was pursuing her doctorate in American literature, and she was pregnant with her second child. And Robert was not her first doctor. She had gone to gynecologists before. She's obviously gone through a pregnancy before. So Robert is definitely getting bolder. As we remember, his normal victim is someone that's really young, really vulnerable, has never gone to an OB-GYN before. But that is not the case for Diane. But Diane was looking for a new doctor that was a bit closer to home. And this is when her friend recommended Robert to her. So on one October morning, Diane went for her appointment with Robert, and Robert immediately launched into a breast and pelvic examination. And during the breast examination, Diane knew straight away that something was not right. For starters, the breast examination, it was prolonged. Robert was carrying out the examination with his whole hand, and it was totally different to every other experience that Diane had had with any other previous doctor. So initially, Diane thought, oh my God, is there something wrong? Like, has he found something? Is that why the examination is prolonged? Is that why he's using different techniques with his hands? So Diane asked Robert, is everything okay? Have you found something? And Robert just went, no, everything's fine, don't worry. So Robert was claiming that this was a normal examination when he literally just groped Diane. Diane felt completely violated, but even worse, there was a female nursing assistant in the room when this was happening. That nurse witnessed this whole thing. And during the invasive and abusive exam, the nurse couldn't look. It's almost like she couldn't look at what was going on. She knew what was going on was wrong, and she just didn't want to acknowledge it. So she just kept her head down. She didn't want to lock eyes with Diane. And then after Robert left the room, Diane could feel the nurse's eyes boring into her. And even though the nurse didn't say anything, just in that eye contact, she felt like the nurse was saying to her, don't come back here. And Diane realized what had happened. She had been sexually assaulted by a doctor. It came as a huge shock to her, because that is the last thing you expect to happen when you go and see a doctor. In the days that followed, Diane ruled out reporting this to the police. She felt like she wouldn't be believed. She was a woman going against a male doctor. So instead, she wrote a letter to Columbia University in the hopes that she could prevent this from ever happening to another woman again. And in her letter, she wrote, I'm 37 years old, have had many gynecological exams in the past, and until being examined by Dr. Haddon, I have never experienced being so disturbed by the way a breast or a pelvic exam was conducted. And after Columbia University received this letter, what did they do? They ignored it. They basically buried it. Hence the beginning of a very long operation of Columbia University and the hospital of covering up the crimes of Dr. Robert Haddon. And after this letter was ignored, many more years passed, which meant that Robert was able to continue on assaulting his patients, and no one did anything. And at this point, the people working alongside Robert, so his receptionists or his nursing assistants, they were fully aware of his dodgy behaviour. They may not have been aware of everything, but they were in the room sometimes when he was literally groping his patients for no medical reason whatsoever. So everyone that is working alongside and with Robert knows what he's doing, because there was one nurse called Rosalina, and she worked for a long time alongside Robert during the 90s. And every time Robert inspected a pregnant patient to see whether they were dilated or not, Rosalina would witness Robert rubbing his fingers up and down his patients in a sexual way. And Rosalina was present for thousands of cervical examinations across multiple doctors every single year, and Robert was the only one she ever saw behaving like this. And obviously Robert had no medical reason to be doing any of this, but Rosalina never reported anything. Or if she did report anything, she was completely ignored. We just don't know which one it is. And in the end, Rosalina ended up witnessing Robert committing these sexual assaults on over 100 patients over the space of 6 years, which is Crazy. And those were just the ones that Rosalina was present for. And we're only talking about the 90s. We haven't even gotten to the 2000s yet. There is another nurse, and we don't know her name, and she did complain to senior management that Robert would always kick nurses out of the examination room, and this was not protocol. However, her complaints were ignored by senior management. And what is even crazier is that exact nurse that complained about Robert, she fell pregnant, and she decided to use her colleague Robert as her OB-GYN. So I am assuming that that particular nurse did not witness any sexual assaults, because why would you choose Robert? But guess what? Robert sexually assaulted this nurse. A nurse that works with him. A nurse that knows what should and shouldn't be happening during these examinations. That is how bold Robert is being. During her examination, Robert started rubbing his erect penis along her arm. He actually did that. And this colleague, who has now become a patient, who has now become a victim, was so stunned and shaken by what happened. When she left that room, she went straight to the receptionist and said, "That man is a pervert." And the receptionist said, "I know. I'm sorry." So it's quite clear that everyone around Robert knows what he's like. Even his receptionist knows he's a pervert, knows that there's something wrong with him. So they're either ignoring this behavior because they feel like they won't be listened to or believed because he is a doctor, or they are complaining and then their complaints are being ignored. But either way, I am just so shocked that no one is doing anything. No one is actually stopping Robert from sexually assaulting his patients. And he has literally just assaulted a colleague, a nurse. So Robert continues assaulting innocent patients throughout the whole of the 90s, and it carries on into the 2000s. So far, Robert has been assaulting patients unchecked for over a decade. And just to put things into perspective, just to make you realize how big this case is, every day on average, Robert would see anywhere between 25 and 40 patients, which adds up to hundreds of patients every single week and thousands of patients every single year. Over the course of that decade, Robert would have had at least 10,000 patients, which is insane. Think of how many victims Robert could have. And so far in this case, I am just sharing you the stories of the victims that have come forward. There are so many more that haven't come forward, that we don't know about, or have come forward and just haven't shared their story. It is thought that Robert's victim count runs into the high 100s, if not thousands. So I just want to put it into perspective that Robert could possibly have thousands of victims. The true victim count of this monster will possibly never be known. And that is what makes this case mind-blowing, that he possibly had thousands of victims and he got away with it for so long. So I have more victim stories to share with you. In 2004, a 27-year-old yoga instructor called Katie Herman was referred to Robert when her regular female doctor wasn't available. And at the very first appointment that Katie had with Robert, she was sexually abused. Katie then went back to her usual female doctor, told her doctor everything that Robert had done to her, and then her female doctor said to her, "Oh, don't worry, that's just what Robert is like." And I'm like, what is going on here? Why are people making excuses for him? He is literally inappropriately touching his patients, and people are saying, "Oh, don't worry, that's just what he's like." No. From that point going forward, Katie refused to even see her usual female doctor ever again, because it's like, why are people making excuses and apologizing for people like Robert? Katie actually stopped going to Columbia University Medical Center full stop because she just didn't trust them, and I don't blame her. But then there is another woman called Gabrielle Diaz who became Robert's patient when she was pregnant. And throughout her appointments with Robert, he conducted prolonged breast examinations of her, where he would examine her breasts with both hands and then he would start pulling and tugging on her nipples. And Gabriella would say, "What are you doing? Like, is everything okay?" Because I think that was the reaction of most patients. They were worried that something was wrong with them, which is why the examinations were prolonged. So Gabriella said, "Is everything okay?" And Robert just went, yep, this is how a normal breast examination goes. And he just brushed her off and said that it was routine. And Robert would go on to sexually assault Gabriella on 10 separate occasions. And then in 2005, Robert started seeing a woman called Charlotte Brooks. He became her main doctor. doctor, and he became Charlotte's main doctor for a period of about 2 years. And over those 2 years, Robert's behavior just starts to become even more increasingly bizarre and disturbing, because this is when Robert started to employ the tactic more often that he would refer to as like sex talk. Because out of the blue, he just started talking to Charlotte about orgasms. He would ask her, could she reach orgasms? Did her partner give her orgasms? How long did it take for her to orgasm? And Robert did this because he wanted the topic of sex to be normalized, and he wanted it to be a comfortable conversation between patient and doctor. And he was playing the long game with Charlotte, because 2 years later, in December of 2007, Robert finally found the opportunity to start sexually abusing Charlotte. He found himself in the examination room alone with her. The nursing assistant had left. And during this appointment, Robert again conducted a very long, invasive breast examination before placing himself in between Charlotte's legs, where he, quote, attempted to masturbate Charlotte by putting his fingers in her vagina. Charlotte was shocked, horrified, traumatized. The only thing she can remember is getting dressed as fast as she possibly could as she got out of there. She just wanted to forget the whole experience, and she just went home. So Robert again got away with sexually abusing another patient. And I think we just need to pause for a second here and remember that Robert has a wife and 2 children. At this point, Robert was in his mid-40s. His children had grown up. His daughter is actually a teenager right now, and his daughter is actually the same age as some of Robert's victims, which, if that doesn't make your skin crawl, I don't know what will. He's literally abusing young girls the same age as his daughter. And then his son, he is disabled. He needs 24-hour care, and Robert is still pretty much the primary caregiver for his son, which is just so bizarre to think about. You've got this monster who all day, every day, week in, week out, year on year, is sexually abusing his patients, and then he goes home and plays the role of a caring husband and father. Everyone loved Robert. The neighbours loved Robert. They would all hang out. No one had a bad word to say about Robert. He was an amazing husband. He was devoted to his wife, Carol. They spent every moment together outside of his work. But what his family and his neighbours and his friends don't know is that as soon as Robert goes to work, he's a sexual predator. And as Robert was getting away with this abuse for over a decade, it is not surprising that he just kept getting bolder, because he now started to develop a system to ensure that his victims would return to him over and over again. First of all, he would encourage them to book their next appointment with him before they'd even had their current appointment. Next, he would make the length of time between appointments shorter and shorter to ensure he could get his victims back in his office as quickly as possible. He would also book patients in for appointments for no reason whatsoever. He just wanted to see them again, and he would just make up, oh, you need to come in just for this little thing. And then finally, he would essentially use birth control medication to manipulate and blackmail his patients, saying that they wouldn't be able to get free birth control anywhere else. You can only get it if you come back and visit me. He would also keep giving out smaller and smaller batches of birth control. Again, this was another tactic to make his patients/victims visit him more often. And that's just despicable, like using free medication to lure and keep his victims. Again, he's taking advantage of patients that are possibly not in the best financial situation, and it's just absolutely disgusting. And because of some of these tactics that Robert did, especially with the medication, some of Robert's patients would continue on seeing him for years. Some patients actually saw him for over a decade. There was one patient, her name is Sarah Stein. She started seeing Robert in 1998, and she had grown up in an Orthodox Jewish household that was very conservative. So she knew basically nothing when it came to sex. The female body, female genitalia, like she just didn't know anything. So when Sarah went for her first appointment with an OB-GYN, which just so happened to be Robert, she had no idea, no information of what was supposed to happen. And she trusted Robert, number one, because he's a doctor. You are supposed to trust doctors. But not just that, he worked at the respected Columbia University. He was also referred to her by her family doctor. Sarah had no reason to question Robert. So she stuck with Robert, and Robert would now be her doctor for the next 12 years. During this time, Robert then sexually assaulted Sarah anywhere between 60 and 80 separate times, which included massaging and groping her breasts, pulling and tugging on her nipples for no medical reason, and rubbing her vagina during the so-called vaginal exams, which included, quote, rubbing all around her labia and clitoris without any medical reason at every single appointment. And he would do this for several minutes. Do you know how long that is to be lying there on an examination table with a doctor between your legs? That is a very long time, especially for a routine checkup where nothing is wrong. Another victim of Robert's was a woman called Emily Anderson. She started seeing Dr. Robert Haddon in 1999, and Robert was her first doctor. She had never had a breast or a vaginal examination prior to this. So again, just like Sarah, she didn't know what was supposed to happen during these examinations, and she trusted Robert because he was a doctor and because he worked at Columbia. I cannot stress enough how many patients I read about that trusted Robert purely because he worked at Columbia University Hospital. They trusted that name, Columbia University. So back to Emily, who is Robert's patient/victim. When she was his patient, she went through several significant medical challenges, which included excessive bleeding, terrible periods, a miscarriage, and fibroids. And Robert took advantage of this by making sure that he was at her beck and call every minute of every day. He wanted Emily to trust him implicitly, which is obviously such a great thing for a doctor to do if they are not a sexual predator. Robert really took his time with Emily. He would answer all of her personal calls, all of her personal emails. He really built up a relationship with Emily. He would be on the phone to her on his cell phone late into the evening. And that was just for like a little chat, just to see that she was doing okay. And Emily trusted Robert so much that in 2005, she moved from New York to Nevada, but she kept Robert as her doctor. So every single time she had an appointment, she would fly from Nevada to New York. Now that is commitment to a doctor. And it just sickens me that Robert has that much control and power and influence over one patient. And Robert was Emily's doctor for 13 years. And over the course of those 13 years, Robert sexually assaulted Emily on 40 different occasions. And he did his usual tactics with Emily. Every single examination, he would conduct his prolonged breast examination by fondling her, groping her with both hands, both breasts, pulling and tugging and squeezing at her nipples. He also made sure that he conducted a vaginal examination at every single appointment, even if there was no need. He also provided unsolicited advice to Emily about sex, about orgasming, how she can achieve climax. And not once did Emily ask for any of this advice. Robert would just constantly talk about sex, and he would talk to her about sex whilst he is touching her vagina, which made her feel extremely uncomfortable, and she just felt really violated. And Emily, of course, is not the only patient that Robert had that he would engage in explicit sexual conversations with. He did it with most of his patients. There was another long-time patient that Robert had called Kate Evans, who visited Robert for over a decade from the late 90s until 2011. And Robert built up trust with Kate by asking about her personal life, talking about his personal life, asking about her children, how she spent her summers, before he would then launch in unsolicited explicit sexual conversations. Again, asking her about orgasms. Can she achieve orgasm? How long does it take? But then he also started giving her advice on how to achieve the perfect orgasm. And he actually said that she should put a pillow to prop her hips up so she could achieve the perfect orgasm. And this was in Kate's very first appointment with Robert. This is what he was doing. He performed his normal breast examination with a nurse present in the room, and then the nurse left the room, and Robert said to Kate, "Oh, just 1 second, I just need to check something else." So Robert is now in the room alone with Kate, and then he pretends that he has to do a second vaginal examination. Robert then took his gloves off, place himself in between Kate's legs, where he then started to sexually abuse Kate by, quote, attempting to masturbate her, erratically touching her vagina area from her clitoris to the end of her vagina, and then putting his fingers inside Kate's vagina. And Kate said she was absolutely petrified. After this examination, or should I say sexual assault, Kate asked Robert if everything was okay with her health. And Robert just very casually said, yep, everything's fine. We'll see you again next year. As if he hadn't just sexually assaulted her. And that is just something so scary to think about, that Robert was able to sexually assault patient after patient after patient. And he was able to just look them in the eye after as if nothing had happened. And at this point, given that Robert has been abusing hundreds of patients for well over a decade now, the complaints had been pouring in. First of all, fellow staff members were complaining about Robert, saying that he was incredibly creepy, inappropriate, had sexual tendencies that did not belong in the workplace. But did senior management ever do anything about these complaints from fellow staff members? No. Next, we need to address patients complaining about him. One patient sent multiple emails in 2007, which were passed on to Robert's manager, who was a man named John. But what did John do about these multiple emails complaining about Robert's sexually inappropriate behavior? Nothing. Just completely ignored them. In 2007, Columbia's University Hospital had no clear policy on how to document patient complaints, or even a guide on how to handle them. How does a hospital not have a way to handle complaints? Like, how does that even make sense? So for every patient that complained about Robert, they were either ignored, deflected, sent around chasing circles going from one number to the next, or gaslighted into thinking that what had happened to them was perfectly normal. So in the late 2000s, Dr. Robert Haddon's personal file was completely clean, even though there had been many complaints from staff members and patients at this point. And as time goes on, Robert's behaviour just continues on getting worse and worse, because now not only is Robert sexually abusing his patients during appointments, he also starts abusing his patients during childbirth. Let that sink in. He is abusing his patients whilst they are giving birth. I never thought I would come across such a thing ever during these cases. So Robert soon moved on to working in the delivery room. And whilst he is in the room with these women, during one of the most significant times in their life that can be equally joyous, but then equally emotionally traumatic, Robert is sexually assaulting them. He would fondle their vaginas inappropriately, insert his fingers in a sexual way when he didn't need to. For one patient, a woman named Eva Santos, she was 18 years old. She had given birth. It was an 18-hour labour. And of course, Robert was the one delivering the baby. And throughout those 18 hours, Robert went on to sexually assault Eva multiple times. He touched her in ways that made her feel incredibly uncomfortable, without gloves. And Ava complained about the way Robert had treated her and what he had done. But Robert just completely ignored her and manipulated her into thinking that what he was doing was perfectly normal during childbirth. There was another woman called Laurie. She went to see Robert 2 days before giving birth, and he was inspecting her cervix. And this is when Robert, quote, forced his whole fist inside her vagina. And Laurie screamed out in pain. She had never experienced anything like this. This was so traumatizing. And Robert just left the room as if nothing had happened. And Laurie said that what Robert had done to her was the most painful thing that she has ever gone through in her life. I'm just truly lost for words with how many victims Robert has. He is literally assaulting patients on a daily basis. And it is just mind-blowing that people know. People are complaining. How can you ignore so many complaints about one doctor? And now we get to 2010. Robert has now been getting away with abusing patients for over 20 years. He is now 50 years old, by the way. And this is when something very significant happens in Robert's life, because his mom passes away. And this is the same mom that Robert craved attention and affection from his whole life. His mom had dreams of him becoming a doctor And Robert did that to please his mom. According to Robert, his mom was the most important person in his life. He was absolutely devastated. He didn't know how to get over the death of his mom. And Robert fell into a deep depression. He lost a lot of weight and he actually started to go to therapy to cope with his grief and his depression. And this just makes me really, really angry because I'm like, you're going to therapy to deal with your grief and depression. Okay, great. Why aren't you going to therapy to deal with the fact that you are a sexual predator and maybe you should stop? But apparently the next 2 years for Robert, from 2010 to 2012, there would be a bit of a blur to him because he was so depressed and he was going through a lot of grief and a lot of issues. But in those 2 years, he still made time to sexually abuse patients. And like I've said multiple times already in this video, I do feel like I'm a bit of a broken record, but his abuse gets worse. The more he gets away with it, he just becomes more emboldened. He keeps pushing the boundaries over and over again to see how much more can he get away with. And it is very understandable why Robert feels invincible, because he has gotten away with this for over 20 years. Multiple patients have complained. Multiple staff members have complained. Fellow medical professionals, nurses have complained about him. But no one seems to care. Everyone seems to just be turning a blind eye because God forbid we tarnish the reputation of this prestigious university, so we will continue on allowing a sexual predator to treat patient after patient, abuse patient after patient, because God forbid we lose our reputation and funding. So in 2010, literally just after his mom died, Robert came up with a new tactic on how he was going to abuse his patients, and this was what Robert liked to call a mole check. And this is not standard practice for an OB-GYN doctor. And what did these mole checks involve? Well, it basically involved a patient stripping for Robert and him groping them from head to toe. In 2011, a woman called Sandra went to visit Robert. He went through his usual prolonged breast examinations, sexually assaulted her while conducting a vaginal examination. And whilst he did this, he also spoke to her in a very sexually explicit way, talking about sex, talking about orgasms, the best sex positions, and everything like that. But then he ordered Sandra to strip, to check all of her moles on her body, to be a good doctor. However, Sandra refused. She was like, no, I don't need my moles checked. I will go to a different doctor if I want that done. I won't go to my OB-GYN. So even though Sandra refused, that didn't deter Robert. No. He tried it with most of his patients. He tried to get most of his patients to strip naked in front of him so he could inspect all of their moles. Because not long after, Robert had a different patient. Her name was Isabella Hernandez. She was 28 years old and she had been a patient of Robert's for a few years at this point. He had previously treated Isabella for a cyst. And as the years went by, his treatment of Isabella was absolutely appalling. He would enter in sexually explicit conversations with Isabella about sex, about orgasms, about sex toys. Does she use sex toys? And she should use sex toys, and what sex toys to use and everything, and the best sex positions to achieve orgasm. Does she like to watch pornography? Does she watch pornography with her partner? And again, it's like, what does this have to do with anything? Like, what does her using sex toys, watching porn, or anything like that have to do with an OB-GYN doctor? And Isabella never once asked Robert about sex. None of that. This was all unsolicited advice. Robert would just speak to her in a very sexually explicit way. Sometimes he would do it whilst he was sexually assaulting her. And over the course of the 3 years where he was her doctor, he would sexually assault Isabella on multiple separate occasions. He would use his whole hand to cup her breasts, squeeze, tug, pull on her nipples for no reason. He also, quote, took his gloves off and attempted to masturbate Isabella by rubbing her clitoris in a circular motion. And there is just so many times when I really had to remind myself that this is a doctor. This is a fully qualified doctor. Has been a doctor for decades. It is scary. It really, really is. And Robert became particularly fascinated with Isabella's breasts. And there was one appointment where he pretended that he wanted to conduct this mole check just so Isabella would strip in front of him. And Isabella stood there with her gown wide open, naked, in front of Robert, thinking that he was being a professional and checking her moles. And this is when Robert just started to grope Isabella's body, complimenting her on her body, complimenting her breast augmentation surgery, saying that the surgeon had done a fantastic job and that her breasts were well proportioned with the rest of her body. He groped her, stroked her, touched her from head to toe, before he then pulled up a stool and sat on the stool so his face was in line with her stomach. And then with his ungloved hand, he just started rubbing all over her body. He went from her breasts to her waist, to her hips, to her thighs. Robert then invited Isabella back for another appointment where he performed his prolonged breast and vaginal examination with a nurse in the room with him. And then the nurse left, and we all know what Robert does now. He says, "Oh, I just need to check one more thing." So this is when he directed Isabella, who was dressed in a medical gown, to bend over his exam table. And he then sexually assaulted her by, quote, opening her buttocks with his fingers and touching her anus and vagina for no medical reason. And Isabella was shocked, horrified. I think this was the first moment where she realized, okay, this is inappropriate. This is not what should be happening in these appointments. She felt completely violated. And from that moment on, she never returned to Robert for another appointment. And this case is just horrifying beyond belief. Cases like this truly make me sick to my stomach. And it is hard to just wrap your head around the fact that Robert is a doctor working at Columbia University Hospital and he is sexually assaulting patients, sometimes with nurses in the room. It is just truly shocking. I cannot believe that this case doesn't have more coverage. And things will soon come to an end. Don't worry, we are getting there. However, like I said multiple times already, it gets worse before it comes to an end. Because there is one more final sick and twisted thing that Robert started to do to his patients. He was so emboldened that he had been getting away with all of this for over 20 years. No one was going to do anything. No one cared about these patients. So this is when Robert started licking his victims' vaginas. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I literally just said that. Yeah, that actually happened. Dr. Robert Haddon is now licking the vaginas of his patients. What do I even say? Like, how? How is he allowed to do this? How is he getting away with this? And it's hard to know exactly when this started. It's definitely not something that he was doing at the beginning. It is definitely something that he grew to do because he was so emboldened because he was getting away with it. However, what we do know is that he was at least doing it from 2008 onwards. There was one patient, a woman called Melissa Taylor, that started seeing Robert in 2008, and she was actually from Pennsylvania. However, she had had a terrible experience with childbirth for her first child in the small hospital in her local town. So she now switched to the prestigious Columbia University Hospital. She just felt like going to Columbia University Hospital, she was going to be able to find a better, more trusted doctor. But then she ended up with Robert. And again, Robert did the exact same thing that he usually did. He built up a relationship with Melissa. Melissa grew to really like Robert, trust him. She kept him as her doctor. She made the 4-hour round trip from Pennsylvania every single time she had an appointment, which is a commitment to travel that far for one doctor. That is why Robert was able to carry on. He was so charismatic. He made people feel comfortable. He did have that unique gift, which is terrifying. And then Robert started sexually abusing Melissa. He sexually assaulted her on 12 separate occasions over the space of 10 months by repeatedly groping her breasts for no reason while she's pregnant. However, things continued to get even worse because one appointment late into her pregnancy, Robert now escalates and he attempted to masturbate Melissa by, quote, penetrating her vagina with his fingers and moving his fingers in and out of her vagina. And this sexual assault was painful. Melissa tensed, she jerked backwards, at which point Robert actually said that he was just trying to reach and touch the baby's head. And then literally out of nowhere, Robert put his face in between Melissa's legs and began licking Melissa's clitoris. Melissa was appalled. At first, she didn't quite know what was going on. I mean, if you're in an appointment with an OB-GYN, is your mind immediately going to go to the fact that the doctor is licking your vagina? Probably not. Melissa felt like she was living in an alternate reality. And then after he had finished sexually assaulting Melissa, Robert then asked Melissa does her husband eat her out? And he should eat her out because it's good for the baby. And he said that literally right after he licked her vagina. Following this, Robert then conducted another prolonged breast examination where he positioned himself between Melissa's legs and started massaging her breasts at the same time and pulling on her nipples. He then started to rub his erect penis along her leg. I just again have no words. Melissa also had no words. She was frozen in shock. However, it wasn't over for Melissa because Melissa's child was born through C-section. So she had to return back to Robert so he could remove her surgical staples. And Robert ordered Melissa to strip, bend over in front of him and touch her toes so he could apparently inspect her from behind because that is completely normal. Following this, Melissa was completely traumatized by her whole experience with Robert and she now refuses to ever see a male gynecologist ever again. And following this assault on Melissa, Robert realized just how much he could get away with. He just kept escalating his attacks further and further. He now continued on licking vaginas throughout most of exams with his patients. He did this with his regular patients. He started licking their vaginas. He did this with new patients. He did this on first appointments with new patients. He did this with patients, victims that we have already spoken about in this video. There was Charlotte Brooks, whose vagina he licked whilst he also inserted his tongue into her vagina. There was also Kate Evans, who Robert sexually assaulted during their final appointment by, quote, licking the folds of her vagina from the clitoris down to the bottom of her vagina, whilst also, quote, penetrating her vagina with his tongue. There was also his regular patient, Emily Anderson, who had had many serious medical issues. And after Robert had conducted a fibroid removal surgery, removing 15 to 18 fibroids, he followed this up by licking her vagina. And then we have new patients that he did it to. There was a woman called Amelia Heckman, who was a fashion model in her late 20s. And at one appointment with Robert, she had her heels in the stirrups, and Robert just started licking her genitalia. There was another woman called Anna Moore, who began seeing Robert in early 2012 after she was worried that she had the HPV virus. And during her appointments, Robert would again engage in very sexually suggestive conversations. He asked her about her pubic hair grooming routine. He also complimented her on the appearance of her vagina, conducted unnecessary and prolonged breast examinations. And then after the nurse left, because that all happened with a nurse in the room, Robert did his usual thing and said that he needed to conduct one more examination, during which he removed his gloves, placed his head between her legs, and started licking her vagina. And he did this for a prolonged period of time, licking back and forth multiple times, including Anna's clitoris. She could feel Robert's beard rubbing against her. And after he had finished assaulting her, Robert just lifted his head up from between her legs and smiled at her. Robert's behaviour now is out of control. I mean, it has been from day one, but now truly it is out of control. This is now 2012, 22 years after the first known assault. And this is a lot to take in, this case. There is a lot of victims, there is a lot of information. So I just want to give you a quick summary of everything that has happened over those 22 years. He has assaulted tens, if not hundreds, of patients every single year. And he was carrying out a variety of different assaults, which included examinations with ungloved hands, excessive long and painful pelvic exams, as well as very prolonged and sexualized breast exams, which included caressing and groping and touching and pulling and twisting. The sexualized conversations that he was also having with his patients just continued on getting more and more out of hand as years went by. He was giving compliments on the appearance of his victims' bodies, their breasts, their vaginas, just how they looked in general. He was giving unsolicited advice on how his patients should reach orgasm, what positions they should use, what sex toys they should use. He was also performing fake mole examinations, which was just a ruse to get his patients to strip in front of him. He would also pose and position his patients in multiple different degrading positions so he could check these so-called moles. But this was literally just to get his sexual kicks. And when he put put his patients in all of these different positions, he would grope them, caress them, sometimes sexually assaulting them by inserting his fingers into their vaginas. He was also penetrating his victims in a number of different ways. And the penetration included both his fingers and his tongue, both anally and vaginally, as well as licking the patient's vaginas at every given opportunity. And when I read all of that, the fact that he is doing this to possibly hundreds of victims every single year for 22 years, it blows my mind. It is thought that Robert could have thousands of victims. And how? Truly, how is he getting away with this? No one should ever be able to get away with these crimes, especially when they are a doctor. How did the university allow this to happen? Because that is exactly what is happening here. The university is allowing Robert to do this to innocent people. Why were they covering up these crimes? Why were they defending him? And just to put this into perspective for how long Robert was abusing victims, he delivered a baby in the 90s who then grew up into a teenager and then became a patient of Robert's when she was a teenager, and he sexually assaulted her as a teenager, and she was a baby that he delivered back in the 90s. It makes me sick to my stomach. Like I said, I couldn't believe I hadn't heard of this case before. I cannot believe there is so little coverage of this case online. There are so many victims of Robert out there. Why have these victims' stories not been heard? Which is part of the reason why I wanted to cover this case. These victims, they need to be heard. And now we finally get to the satisfying part of this case, which is Robert's downfall. But it's not all smooth sailing, oh no, there's still bumps in the road, unfortunately. Because in 2012, a woman called Laurie Kanyuk, who will now be very significant to today's case, she was under the care of Dr. Robert Haddon. And Laurie, she was a professional dancer, she was currently 38 years old, and she was currently 8 months pregnant, so she was getting close to her due date. And in the past, Laurie had had a miscarriage, as well as recently undergoing spinal treatments. So she was high risk, she was worried about possible complications with her current pregnancy, and this was originally why she first got in contact with Robert. And at first, Laurie really liked Robert. He came across as really friendly, he was soft-spoken, he almost had like a fatherly kind of way to him. She's actually described him as almost being like Santa Claus. However, during her more recent appointments, Laurie had started to notice that things were not quite right. Because one time when her feet were in the stirrups, she felt a flicker of something moist against her vagina. But at the time, she had no idea that it was Robert's tongue. Another time when Robert was performing a cervical examination, he inserted his fingers into her vagina and pulled her with such force that his fingers lifted her into the air off of the exam table. And Laurie could hear Robert grunting and moaning almost in a sexual way. And he did this until she bled. But Laurie, because she was so close to giving birth, she just put all of these incidents behind her because all she was focused about was her child, her healthy delivery. She didn't want to change doctors so late. And she did have a healthy delivery. She gave birth to a baby girl and everything was fine. But shortly after giving birth, Robert was back to sexually abusing Laurie before extracting her breast milk for no medical purpose and then tasting it in front of her, which just sounds like how I don't have any words. It really is a horror movie come to life. Like, how did this actually happen? And then 6 weeks later, Laurie had to return for a follow-up appointment. And then this is when she experienced something out of her worst nightmares. Because while she was on the exam table, she was just casually scrolling through her phone, letting Robert carry out the examination without giving it another thought. When all of a sudden, she realized that down below, Robert was licking her vagina. Laurie instantly jolted her body back. She saw Robert below her. He was red and flustered, and he just froze before nervously rambling on, trying to make excuses for what he was doing. And this is when Laurie immediately texted her boyfriend. She said, quote, Dr. Haddon just licked my vagina. I'm shaking and I'm freaking out. Now, Laurie's boyfriend did not mess around, and I don't blame him. He literally stopped what he was doing. He dropped everything. He ran out of the street, handed $50 to a taxi driver to take him just a couple of blocks to Laurie, and he went straight to Dr. Haddon's office. Once inside, he rescued Laurie. I don't know if he came in contact with Dr. Haddon. If he had, I assume words were probably exchanged. And then afterwards, Laurie's boyfriend dialed 911. And Laurie's boyfriend didn't even know how to put it into words what had happened to Laurie. Because how do you say that your doctor, your OB-GYN, just licked your vagina? Like, actually, like, think about it. How do you actually say that to a 911 operator? And not just any doctor, a doctor at the prestigious Columbia University Hospital. And you can actually hear parts of this 911 call online. And Laurie's boyfriend ended up saying that the doctor touched Laurie orally.
911 operator 1520, where's your emergency?
My fiance was at her OB-GYN. He basically did something inappropriate to her.
Okay, did he?
I just went up there and took her from there and brought her home.
Did he harass her, sir? What?
No, he basically touched her orally.
Okay.
And so the police came out to Laurie straight away. They took her statement. And as they were doing this, Laurie received a phone call from Dr. Robert Haddon. And Laurie ignored the call. I mean, obviously she is not going to answer that. And then Robert left her a voice message. And you can hear this voice message that he left her. And oh my God, it makes your blood boil.
Hi, Laurie. It's Dr. Haddon calling. It's like 4:30 on Friday. You know, I just got word that you called the office and you're upset and you were calling the police. What the heck happened? What's going on? You know, please, can we talk? If you can, please just give the office a call or come back and, you know, talk face to face.
He was trying to act all casual. He was like, "Hi, Laurie, it's Dr. Haddon calling. I got word that you're upset." And then he says, "What the heck happened? What's going on? I don't understand." And it's like, really? Really, Robert, you don't understand what you've done wrong. You don't understand what happened. Well, I'll tell you what happened. You've sexually assaulted hundreds, if not thousands of patients over 2 decades, and now you're finally being caught.
I don't understand. I just know that, you know, I just got word from like the, you know, first from the secretary and then from our office manager here and the nurse. I'm very upset. I don't know what's going on. So please call me back or, all right.
He was just trying to gaslight Laurie like he did with all of his victims, but he was clearly spooked enough about Laurie thinking, oh no, this is where I'm going to get caught. And the police listened to this voicemail and they said, right, let's go get this pig. So they go and arrest Robert the very same day. It was a Friday evening. Robert's superiors at the hospital were told that an investigation was going to be carried out. So they knew exactly what was going on. Laurie was then taken to do a rape test, and she truly thought that all of this was going to be over soon. He was arrested, there was going to be an investigation, and that was going to be the end of it. But then the very next day, on the Saturday, Robert was released. And then I feel like I just need to pause for a second here and just brace yourselves for this next part. So he was arrested on Friday. He was released from custody on Saturday. And then on Tuesday, he was back at work. I feel like I want to pull my hair out. He was back at work. He was back seeing patients. The police arrested him for sexually assaulting a patient. They informed Columbia University Hospital that that is what they had done and that they were investigating him. Yet for some reason, Columbia allowed him back at work. All they did was require Robert to have a chaperone in the room with him at all times. And we know from just the few victims that we have spoken about in this video that Robert really doesn't actually care if someone's in the room or not. So Robert is now back at work. And guess what? He gets right back to sexually assaulting patients. But not only did Columbia allow Robert back at work, they also made sure that these allegations never saw the light of day by hiring a very expensive defense lawyer who, quote, specialized in men behaving badly. So on that Tuesday, Robert is now back at work with a chaperone, and he went straight back to sexually assaulting patients straight away. You would think that he would lay low. He has just been arrested for sexual assault. You would think that maybe he would stop, that it would spook him, but he just doesn't care. He's so confident. Just 4 days after being arrested for sexually assaulting a patient, he is back at work sexually assaulting patients. And the university is allowing him to get away with this because they have been complicit for a very long time. Let's not get it twisted. But now they really are just an accomplice. And in the weeks that followed, whilst Robert was allowed back at work with a chaperone, he was able to sexually assault dozens more patients using all of his usual techniques. And one of these included a woman called Evelyn Yang, who was 7 months pregnant with her first child. Robert sexually assaulted her during one of her appointments. And it turns out that Evelyn Yang was the wife of a prominent businessman and lawyer, Andrew Yang, who would later run a campaign to become a presidential candidate. And Evelyn does play a significant role in today's case, so she does come back up. But before that, after Robert is allowed to assault dozens more patients, he is finally suspended 5 weeks later. And then a few months after that, Robert came to an agreement with the university where they allowed him to retire early so that none of these accusations and assaults came to light. It's just unbelievable, isn't it? He just goes on to sexually assault many patients for over 2 decades, and he gets to retire respectfully early. So at the age of 54, Robert puts his feet up and starts to enjoy his retirement alongside his wife and his 2 children. And a formal investigation was carried out into Robert's misconduct, but Columbia never informed any of Robert's patients about this. They tried to keep this in the dark for as long as possible. All they did was inform his previous patients that he had retired and offered no further explanation. Even after he left the university hospital, they are still trying to cover up his crimes. And at this point, months passed and nothing was being done about Robert. The DA actually did open up an investigation, but then quickly closed it because they decided that there wasn't enough evidence. And Laurie was horrified. She wanted to testify. She wanted her day in court, but the DA didn't want to prosecute her case. But Laurie didn't give up. She still proceeded in suing Robert and the university in a civil suit. And then a couple of months later, she decided to take it even further by taking her case to the press. And her story didn't get much attention. It was a small little article on page 10 of a New York newspaper. However, this small little article on page 10 would start a ripple effect because one day another one of Robert's victims, Laurie Maldonado, who we have already talked about in this case, she was on her way to work and she had that New York newspaper and she saw that small article on page 10 about Dr. Robert Haddon. And it brought back a flood of traumatic memories about what she had gone through at the hands of Robert. So she quickly got in touch with Laurie Kanyuk and then went to the DA's office herself to also tell her story. But it wasn't just her. Dozens more victims saw that article and came forward. So now Laurie had the numbers behind her case, so it could no longer be ignored. So the DA finally went about prosecuting this case, but oh my God, were they useless. Because it was 2016, approximately a year before the Me Too movement gained prominence, and a man named Cyrus Vance Jr. was the current district attorney for New York County. And it is thought that he has a real aversion to prosecuting sexual assault cases, especially if they will be challenging to win. And just to put things into perspective, a year earlier in 2015, this man, Cyrus Vance Jr., refused to prosecute Harvey Weinstein, even after a detailed NYPD investigation was made into him. So yeah, it seems like this district attorney really didn't want to prosecute possibly powerful men that were accused of sexual assault. So as soon as Robert Haddon's case came up, Cyrus invited Robert's expensive defense lawyer into his office, and it turns out that Robert's defense lawyer and the DA, Cyrus Vance Jr., they were good friends. Suspicious, if you ask me. The defense lawyer used to work for him as a prosecutor, and they even asked the DA to preside over their wedding. So they were pretty close. And in the end, this expensive defense lawyer and Cyrus, the DA, they worked together to get Dr. Robert Haddon the plea deal of a lifetime. So they had their little meeting and they agreed that Robert should plead guilty to 1 felony and 1 misdemeanor of his choice, which is just crazy. It's like, why are you allowing Robert to decide which one he pleads guilty to? But okay. He would be added to the sex offenders register. He would surrender his medical license. However, most importantly, he would not spend 1 day in prison. And also they agreed that he would not be allowed to be prosecuted in the future for similar crimes known in the DA's office. So basically, translation, Robert's going to get away with everything because he's already retired. Who cares if he hands in his medical license? Okay, he's on the sex offenders register, but how is that actually going to affect his life? And as you can imagine, his victims were absolutely appalled. How was he allowed to sexually assault hundreds, if not thousands, of patients over 2 decades and not spend 1 day in prison? The victims were disgusted with how they were treated. Lori continued on fighting her civil suit. Eventually, she was rewarded $475,000. However, after fighting this case for so long, it had took so much out of Lori. She literally was so burnt out. She had a breakdown. She collapsed in the middle of the street. It had just been too much for her. It was just too overwhelming. So now we jump forward quite a few years and we now get to 2020. And just a reminder, this is 8 years after Robert was arrested for assaulting Lori and 4 years after that plea deal of a lifetime. And he has still not spent 1 single day in prison. He still has his feet up, enjoying his retirement. However, things were about to change. And this is now where Evelyn Yang comes back into this story. Because Evelyn Yang, remember, she was married to the presidential hopeful Andrew Yang? Well, over the last few years, Evelyn had come forward as a victim of Robert's to authorities, but she had remained anonymous. And this was because of her high profile. And then as time passed, as the Me Too movement gained traction, more and more women were coming forward over various different assaults. And this is when Evelyn made the very brave decision to finally make it public that she was also a victim of Dr. Robert Haddon's. This must have been an incredibly difficult decision for her because she was somewhat of a public figure. Because at the time the 2020 Democratic primaries were taking place, her husband was one of the candidates hoping to become president. He had an incredibly high profile, but Evelyn had spoken to many victims of sexual abuse along the campaign trail. She was moved by their bravery, and she was hoping if she could add her name to the Dr. Robert Haddon case, she could help even more victims. So in the midst of all the campaigning, Evelyn arranged an interview with CNN and shared her story publicly for the first time.
It started with inappropriate questions. The examinations became longer, more frequent.
And she talked about her abuse at the hands of Robert, how it had happened all the way back in the summer of 2012, which was just after he abused Lori Kanyuk.
I was in the exam room and I was dressed and ready to go. And then at the last minute, he kind of made up an excuse. And he proceeded to undress me and examine me internally, ungloved.
And there was no one else in the room?
No. In fact, when I think back to most of our exams, I don't think there was somebody in the room.
And after Evelyn gave this interview, everything changed. Because once the story aired, it gained national prominence.
The indictment reads like the acts of a serial sexual predator. 6 victims, 9 counts, criminal sexual abuse, women who were forcibly touched, orally violated. The alleged perpetrator, a respected OB-GYN at New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center, accused of assaulting his own patients. But Dr. Robert Haddon served no jail time for his crimes. He cut a deal with the DA's office in New York and pleaded guilty to just 2 charges.
It caught the attention of hundreds of Robert's victims. Dozens more began speaking publicly about their experience with Robert. There was also another victim, Marissa Hochstetter, who had been sharing her experience publicly with Robert for quite a while. And she too made a big difference. And given the scale of his crimes and how many victims were coming forward, this is when it finally caught the attention of the US Department of Justice, and they wanted to re-prosecute the case. However, if you remember, the useless New York County DA, in their deal that they made with Robert, they said that he could not be prosecuted for any similar crimes in the future that were known to the DA's office. So to get around this little clause in the deal, the Department of Justice wanted to bring new federal charges against Robert for sex trafficking, which included persuading women to cross state lines to engage in illegal sexual activity, which would carry a more severe penalty. And once this second investigation got underway, this is when it came to light the massive cover-up by Columbia University. Not only did they fail to inform patients that their doctor was being investigated for sexual assault, but during the first prosecution in 2016, Columbia had failed to turn over evidence. They buried important documents, deleted emails, withheld critical pieces of Robert's personnel file. And also, when new victims came forward directly to Columbia, they tried to keep them quiet and refused to hand over their information to the DA's office. And in the end, a criminal investigation was opened into Columbia. They eventually settled with 200 of the victims for a total of $230 million. However, in the end, not one person from Columbia University has ever been charged with a crime or has faced any punishment due to what Dr. Robert Haddon has done. They barely even offered an apology. And yes, it is Robert's fault. He is responsible for what he is doing, but he's also a doctor in a hospital, and the hospital has a duty of care to their patients to protect them from people like Robert. However, at the beginning of 2023, 11 years after his initial arrest and 7 years after that bogus plea deal, this is when Dr. Robert Haddon was finally brought to trial. And at this point, he was 64 years old. He tried to give a sob story in his defense, saying that he needed to return home to care for his family because he's the primary caregiver, that he shouldn't have to spend a single day in prison. However, this is when the victims were allowed to come forward to give their statements. Their voices were finally properly heard, and the testimony that they shared was truly horrifying. And the testimony from the victims is mostly what you have heard in today's video. It is where all of the graphic language, the details, everything has come from. It was what was shared in the court documents. And over the course of the 2-week trial, witness after witness sat on that stand. Each story was worse than the last. I can't even imagine what was going through the minds of the jury on this case. And by the end of the trial, Robert Haddon, I shouldn't even call him Dr. Robert Haddon anymore because his medical license has been taken away from him. Robert Haddon was found guilty on all charges. And a few weeks later, Robert returned to court for sentencing, and he was given the maximum sentence of 20 years for each charge, which is to be served concurrently. If you ask me, he should have been going to prison for the rest of his life. There should never be a chance for someone like Robert Haddon to walk the streets again. And to this day, the ramifications of this case are still being felt. There are still lawyers working right now on behalf of victims trying to claim compensation. It is thought that over 300 victims have come forward, but I am sure that there are so many more. It really could be into the thousands. And I just hope that they all get the support that they need and deserve. They are so brave for coming forward and telling their story, and for not giving up and finally bringing this man to justice. And if you want to know more about this case and the individual stories of the victims, I highly recommend checking out the article that I have linked in the description box, or the podcast series called Exposed: Cover Up at Columbia University, because a lot of the victims share their story there. And I just want to end this video sharing the names and the images of the victims that came forward for that article and the years that they were a patient of Robert's. Toby Pillavin Weinstein, 1992 to 1994. Robin Bass Lavender, 1992 to 2005. Diane Monson, 1993. Rosa Meyerlin, 1993 to 2012. Crystal Rose, 1994. Louisa Soler, 1996 to 2007. Dawn W., 1997 to 2011. Amy, 1999 to 2012. Wendy Josephsberg, 2000 to 2004. Dana Solomon, 2002 to 2012. Liz Hall, 2002 to 2012. Christina Arethas, 2003 to 2004. Sia Hobson, 2003 to 2012. Laurie Maldonado, 2003 to 2012. Balkis Hull, 2005 to 2010. Edina, 2006 to 2011. Eva Santos, 2008. Elliot Maffey, 2009. Marissa Hochstetter, 2009 to 2012. Laurie Kanyuk, 2011 to 2012. Sandra Abramovich, 2011 to 2012. Lindsay Powell, 2011 to 2012. Evelyn Yang, 2012. And just seeing all of those images of the victims really does put it into perspective, the scale of this case, especially when you realize that is only 23 victims out of hundreds. And I just wish all of these victims the best. I am so sorry for what they went through. I'm so sorry that no one listened to them, that they didn't feel like they could be heard. And I just truly hope that they are doing okay. And a lot of them still want Columbia to be held accountable. And I agree. They want Columbia to answer for the cover-up of their crimes. They still campaign to this very day. And I just truly hope that they get what they're looking for. And I just hope that speaking about cases like we have today, we can continue raising awareness, open up conversations, become more comfortable talking about these things, and just try and prevent predators from Robert ever operating and ever getting away with their crimes. So that is the end of today's absolutely heartbreaking case. I don't even know how to end this video. As always, let me know your thoughts, theories, and opinions. And don't forget to let me know your case suggestions in the comments down below, because I always want to know what you want to hear next. Thank you again to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video, and I'll see you all in my next one. Bye.